So if I want to print cheese like 50 trillion times, right? Rather than doing like typing out print cheese, I could put it in a loop or I could put it in this function and I could just call the function 50 times, which is still actually pretty inefficient. So you wouldn't do something as simple as printing cheese in a function. However, if you had something a little bit more complicated, such as addition, then you might want to use a function, depending on how much you're going to add things. So if I want to add um, a bunch of different numbers, then rather than typing out print 5 plus 4 and then um, print 6 plus 4, print 7 plus 4, right? Instead, I could just put it in this addition function. And then all I would have to do instead is do addition, put in the numbers 5 and 4, oops, 5 and 4, right? 6 and 4, and 7 and 4. And right now, it might seem like this is about the same amount of work, but in reality, when you have a lot more complicated of a task than even addition, for example, on your robot, if you want to have some process occur when some event happens, for example, if my joystick is moved, then I want to move the robot X inches forward, depending on how much the joystick has moved, right? To do something like that, you will almost 100% need to use a function. Okay, so this might seem like a really poor example, but it is definitely important to know how to use a function. Now, when you're making a function, right, you have to use def. You have to put def at the beginning, which means define. Then you have to put the name of your function. It can be anything you want as long as it's not another word that exists already. Like I can't type just print, right? I have to do, if I tried running this, it's going to give me an error. But if I do print cheese, which has some other stuff, then I can do like anything else. Now here you see I used addition, so I can't do that. But anyway, you can name it whatever you want. Then you put these parentheses and you put these values inside. And then you put this colon and put whatever the task is that you want to have happen. Now these values that I have inside, you might be noticing that what is number one and number two? Is it actually the number one and actually the number two? Obviously not, because if I did 1 plus 2, I should get 3 in here, which I'm clearly not getting. See how I did not get 3 in this whole bunch of junk, right? Instead, what these actually are placeholders. So they're not actually the number one, or they're not like, yeah, essentially they're not just the number one, and they're not a variable that always remains the same. This is essentially more like a placeholder. It is a variable, but it acts almost like a placeholder rather. So essentially what happens here is when I do addition and I put 5 in here, it replaces number 1 with 5, and it replaces number 2 with 4, and it replaces all the other places where I typed number 1 and number 2 with those numbers. So right here, instead of number 1 and number 1, it'll put 5 and 5, and here it'll put 4 and 4. And then it does print 5 plus 4, which gives me 9, wherever that is. I'll just hide this stuff for now. Yeah. So when I run this, it gives me 9 right here. Now, um, something to keep in mind, if I tried to do print number 1 outside of the function, this won't work, okay? Because that number 1 that I say, right? Number 1 is something called a local variable, which means it only exists in the quote unquote scope of this function. Okay, the scope of the variable is local in this function. So I can't refer to this variable outside of the function. And essentially, the variable doesn't exist outside of the function. Now, if I copied the same line of code and put it inside the function, then it would work. Wait, let me just get rid of this error code. Right. Then it'll work. You see, um, I don't know which one it is. Yeah, I think this is the thing that printed 5, right? So if I put it inside, it does work. But if I put it outside, it won't work. Similarly, if I try to use this multiplication thing, right, and I put the placeholder x and I put the placeholder y, it creates a new local variable called x, and it does this operation with the new local variable named x. And x, as I mentioned earlier, is a placeholder. So now if I did, right, just comment this stuff out again. If I did multiplication, 3 and 4, you'll see it returns 12, not 20. Because if it was 5 over here and it put 4 as y, it would do 5 times 4, which is 20. But instead it gives me 12 because it uses the local copy, or it uses the local variable x, not the other x, which is actually called a global variable x. Okay, so keep that in mind. If I try to do print x, it's not going to print 5, it's going to print um 3. Yeah, it's gonna print 3. Right here, I did print x on the outside, and it printed 5, because this is outside of the function where the local variable x doesn't exist. But the global variable x does exist, so it uses the global one. But inside, it'll just default to using the local one. Now, at the same time, if I did print x over here, I'll get rid of this one, and I run the addition thing. Let's just take this out. Let me just change this to 2. Okay. Now if I run it, it will still be able to print 5 because it knows that there is no local variable named x, and there is a global variable named x. So instead I'll just use the global one. Now what do you think will happen if I try to do um yeah, actually never mind. But yeah, by default it will use your local variable. And then if it doesn't have a local variable named x, it will use the global one. So yeah, that's essentially all it is for variables. As I said, these are arguments or parameters. These inside values are arguments or parameters, but you can also have a function which doesn't have arguments or parameters. It's just, yeah, it doesn't have any dynamic execution. It doesn't have any, you know, changes every time it's run. When I run print cheese, right, I don't need to put anything in because it's always going to do the same thing, and it's just going to print cheese. Of course, you can also do something like change global x, right? So if I want to refer to the outside variable, the actual, like the better way to do it, hang on. One thing I need to mention. If I'm referring to the variable x and I'm just referring to it, like I just want to know what the value is, or I just want to use its value, then I can just do this. But if I want to change something about the variable x, if I want to change it from being 5 to 4, right, I have to use this thing called global. So I do global x, and then I can do x equals 8. So when I do print x here versus when I do print x here, I'll get two different things. And of course, they're both referring to the global variable x, okay? Because I didn't create a new variable named x inside here. I referred to the global variable x over here. If I tried to change the global variable x here, just like this, like if I didn't put global, right, and now I tried to do this, it'll give me an, or rather it won't do anything. It'll create a local variable named x and set it to 8. And obviously I don't do anything with this local variable, so you won't see it. If I did print x here now, you'll say that it thinks x is equal to 8, but even though I run it afterward, it still prints x as 5. One more thing you need to keep in mind when you use a function is how the control flow works. So if I call print cheese over here, even though I print x over here, what it does is it comes to this line of code and then it goes back. It goes back all the way to where it finds this function named print cheese. Then it reads whatever's inside the body of print cheese and it executes that. And it uses whatever parameters are inside as well, if I had put any over here. So yeah, even if I put something like print x over here, or rather, Um, if I put print x even at the very beginning, right, it will run before the function. And even if I put print x after, it will still run before the function because the function was not called before this. So the body of the function only executes when it's called. And it's called when I put this parentheses in the name of the function and whatever arguments I want to put. For example, the ones I did over here. So yeah, that's about it with functions. Yeah. And I'm not sure if you noticed, but there is functions that you've already been using so far. For example, print is actually a function. So if I do quack, right, you might notice that I put in an argument in here. This is the name of my function, and these are the familiar parentheses we're used to. And there are actually arguments for it. For example, I can do end equals this. And that is a real parameter that exists. So now if I run it, see how it does quack quack? You don't need to worry about the specifics of what I did here, but all I wanted to show is that there are other parameters.